for a long time. His philological interests, his dedication to meticulous reading, his interest in textual structure as evidenced in structure, sign, and play, and his interest in figuration as revealed in the white mythology were taken as evidence back then that we were dealing with a textual critic, not a social theorist. Especially Derrida's essay, Living on Borderlines, which was on Shelley and was published alongside work by Hillis Miller, Jeffrey Hartman, and Harold Bloom in a volume called Deconstruction and Criticism, was supposed to make it clear to us precisely where Derrida was coming from in terms of disciplinary orientation, namely English departments. Then in late 1980, Derrida did something that came as a shock to those of us who held his perception, namely his publication of the postcard. How could it be that the very person who had advanced the concept of écriture, who had been promoting the idea of the death of the subject, who had written articles and books that had made a mockery of metaphysical thinking, and who had made the word presence a suspect word, could in good faith be offering us what amounted to an autobiographical account of himself as a lover in the throes of a supposed torrid love affair? What on earth was going on here? Had Derrida recanted everything he had written in the past? Had we gotten him all wrong? It was clear that whatever the case was, we were at the very least in the midst of a second major phase of Derrida's work, one that had already begun, perhaps already in Glas, but certainly in the period immediately after, with Derrida's explicit look towards the work of Maurice Blanchot, in particular with respect to Blanchot's fiction, in which operability and inoperability are undecidedly at work, if that's the right word, in and as the process of a narration that is neither fiction nor nonfiction, and in which the speaker is neither present nor absent. Whereas in Beckett one could still speak of an existential condition or situation, in Blanchot that was no longer quite possible, because character had been erased by the very voice of which it was supposedly the origin. Something like that was going on in La Carte Postale, and Postcard as well, or was supposed to, I imagine. The letters were supposed to be self-destructing through the very process of their being written. Their very performance was supposed to obliterate their performativity, hence leaving us with scraps of paper with mere marks upon them, a sort of écriture, or trace work, if you will. Now, since there's no time to talk about the envoi generally, I'd like to call your attention to Derrida and the photomap, that little booth that was to be found in shopping malls or airports in which one could take a self-portrait, either alone or with a friend, that would be instantly developed due to Polaroid technology. We find that, interestingly enough, Derrida, who had been careful not to disseminate his image until sometime in the early or mid-1980s, there's a whole thing to be said about that. He really made a kind of thing of not having his image anywhere. We didn't know what this guy looked like until about 1985. People in Paris did who could meet him, but you know, a lot of people in the U.S. had no clue as to what his appearance was like. So Derrida had been careful not to disseminate his image until sometime in the mid-1980s, was going to these little booths to take pictures of himself that he would subsequently tear up into bits. Obviously, this is some sort of performative act that one might identify with self-loathing, with the suicidal impulse that we can find in the letters, with a certain death drive, and probably much else. And yet the desire to be photographed is subject to a certain repetition compulsion as well. So here's a quote. I'm looking at page 79 in the English. If you come back alone, we could once again abuse the photomaton in the station. Those of us with imagination can conjure up what one does with a woman in a photo booth. That is, with what sorts of pictures might be taken there and why one might be inclined to rip them up. Even when the beloved isn't there, Derrida writes, quote, when I photograph myself alone in stations or airports, I throw it away or tear the thing into little pieces that I let fly out the window if it is a train, leave them in an ashtray, or in a magazine if it's an airplane. Okay. Another two little references I can't go into. One is Artaud, the burning of the paper, or the use of cigarettes to burn them. And obviously that remark at the beginning of Glas from Genet about the ripping up of the Rembrandt. Those are these two. I'm sure there must be others. In other words, no self-representations without mutilation, destruction, effacement. But also no self-representations without the leaving behind of some trace, like bits stuffed into a magazine for the next person to discover. In this, the photographs imitate or repeat the letters in the postcard, which, as you will recall, are partially mutilated. Like the letter, the photograph is, quote, lost for the addressee at the very second when it is inscribed. Its destination is immediately multiple, anonymous, and the sender, as they say, and the addressee yourself, my beloved angel, and yet how I miss you. You alone now, I cry over you and smile at you here, now, right here. I'll pass over the smile, about which we heard some interesting thoughts at yesterday's roundtable. Rather, I have to mention that having withdrawn or erased or canceled or destroyed the letter and the photograph, I'm speaking generically, Derrida insists he is sending in their place something to the beloved that matters much more, namely, his memory of himself and the beloved. For by this sending, he claims to be actually touching the beloved. Quote, I touch you by sending you whatever, even if it is nothing, unquote. It is as if he were saying, in this memory, here I am, and in its sending, it's being directed towards you. There you are touched by me. Of course, it is because memories are ineffable that lovers send photographs of themselves, or have them taken when they are together, given that the image is what signs for the validity of a memory, or if you like, the presence of the couple as a couple in love, who have been touched and who may even be touching one another, and yes, even sexually in a photo booth. For who among us hasn't done this? But it is precisely this image, or token, or sign that Derrida seems eager to tear up, and as we saw, leave traces of. Clearly, Derrida's desire to replace a letter or a photograph with a memory that has no material support, independent of processes that go on in the brain, indicates more than just an iconoclastic frame of mind. Superficially, what Derrida wants to destroy is the thing that signs for the act of touching another, because that thing is believed to misrepresent the act for which it signs. Though I suspect there's something more psychologically motivated than this, which goes back to a theme I discussed in a paper elsewhere on Gerhard Richter's art, namely shame. That's the theme I want to end on. I'm wondering if the performance of destroying the letter and the photograph isn't motivated so much out of philosophy, though it's easy for Derrida to make that case, than out of shame. After all, he was conducting an adulterous affair. And to be perfectly frank about it, adultery seems to have been a lifelong pursuit of Derrida's, which is public knowledge, of course, and which Derrida has even gone so far as to broadcast in the very letters which we can read in the postcard, as if the act of representing the act of adultery were as compelling a sort of performativity as performing the adulterous acts themselves. And yet, in representing or signing for these acts, that is, in terms of vouching for their having taken place, there is a concomitant erasure that, given my analysis elsewhere of the blur in Gerhard Richter's art, suggests the presence of a guilt or tort that is performed very much in line with what Roy Schaefer, in his book Bad Feeling, describes as the psychology of shame. A psychology that Derrida, in fact, also erases, hides, and tears up by way of a philosophical account of the signature of which the photograph, if not the letter, is an instance. Here, of course, I must mention the name of Paul de Man, because there, too, we have this very same issue of shame, which Derrida managed to deconstruct, and even outbid in a fit of self-righteous rage at de Man's detractors in the essay Biodegradables. As if compelled to entertain the shameful in the aftermath of the de Man affair, Derrida even went so far as to rehabilitate as virulent an anti-Semite as Carl Schmitt, who served time in jail after the Second World War for his role in the Nazi regime, and whose shamelessness as a shamed individual continued right up through the end of his career, even to the point of accusing America of foul play. This is in a book called Nomos of the Earth. Of accusing America of foul play and thinking up the concept of war crimes in relation to the Holocaust, as if the Holocaust were a justifiable means of dealing with so-called enemies of the state. That's one of the pathetic elements of Nomos of the Earth, of what Carl Schmitt's doing. I mentioned Schmitt in relation to de Man because I think the de Man affair was quite traumatic for Derrida, and there is something about the invocation of Schmitt. If you think de Man is a Nazi,